Hi everyone, hope you're well, hope you can hear me. I'm just gonna make sure, because we're recording today's session, that it's just me that you can see on the screen, or maybe not, I can't get it working. Great to have you join us. We're quite a select group. So what I'm going to do is I'll keep an eye on the waiting room and let people in as they join. Sometimes there's a bit of a delay with the Zoom, getting the Zoom details. And then what I'm going to do is just run through the slides, but then because there's just a small group of us, we can end the recording and then have a general chat about your particular interest in kind of sustainability and the whole greening of global trade subject. So quite an informal kind of thing. There's not going to be, certainly not going to be hundreds of people turning up. Hopefully it'll just be a couple more and then it'll be a nice small group for a discussion at the end. Some of you may know me already. My name's Andrea Collins. My company is Global Trade Department, and I'm going to let somebody else in. And we provide basically global trade specialist services to private sector clients, we call private clients, and also clients that come to us via growth hubs and also via local chambers. So we've got a good mix of kind of corporate clients and also SMEs. I have to be honest, the SMEs are my passion because they're potentially the corporates of tomorrow. So they're the ones that we really get a kick out of supporting. So that's kind of me in a nutshell, and obviously we can talk and do more introductions after I've gone through the slides. But today is the 5th webinar in a series of webinars that we're doing for the East Midlands Growth Hub Cluster, which has been a client of ours for the last 3 years. We supported their clients through a lot of the Brexit turmoil, and now our focus is on preparing them for, well, basically keeping them compliant, helping them trade, helping them extend their market reach, break into new markets, but also import more cost effectively and more compliantly. And obviously one of the big things on the agenda is sustainability, and it's certainly something that I'm very passionate about, and it's something that I feel particularly smaller businesses are not ready for the raft of regulation that's coming down the line, which is going to impact their ability to import and export. So I'm very passionate about getting the word out there and making sure that the support's in place to help them continue and help them profit in a kind of more greener, more sustainable global supply environment, if you like. So I'm just going to run through some of these slides. Like I say, we can have a discussion at the end. Just by means of a very brief agenda, we're going to talk about the impact of global trade on sustainability, talk about sustainable global trade. What is it? Why is it really important? Talk about sustainability and how it's going to frame the future of our imports and exports. And then we'll talk about some of the frameworks that are readily recognised and available to help us kind of develop a more sustainable approach to import and export. And predominantly, we're going to be talking about the UN Sustainable Development Goals there. We're going to talk about stakeholder involvement in terms of drafting your sustainability strategy and implementing that strategy. And by that, we'll probably touch on materiality assessments. Now, they're not something that Global Trade Department does. We work with a number of sustainability experts who do these materiality assessments with businesses, and I'll talk through what they're about, but they're a phenomenal way of involving stakeholders both inside the organisation and outside the organisation to help craft your sustainability agenda. And then we'll talk about the importance of sustainability with reference to obtaining finance and investment. And we'll touch on a little bit on a programme that we run for Oxlep and why we've got that insight into the investment community and how we know that sustainability is an increasingly important tick box for them. Actually, it goes beyond a tick box for them, but we do know that investors have developed a real social conscience throughout the duration of the pandemic, and we see more and more investment going to social impact businesses and businesses with a purpose, if you like. Then we'll talk about compliance with current and future regulations. So we'll touch on some of the regulation that's coming down the line and how businesses can start to gear up to actually complying with that regulation. And then we'll talk about global trade sustainability assessments, which is something that we do. Global Trade Department does for our clients, and also it's something that certainly for businesses that are based in the East Midlands, they can access that service, and it's fully funded by the East Midlands Growth Hub Cluster. So we're seeing a lot of interest in that region for that. And then finally, we'll touch on empowering SMEs and international trade programme. That's the programme that the East Midlands Growth Hub Cluster is funding, but you don't have to be in the East Midlands to tap into our support. There's lots of different ways to access our expertise, and we're always happy to pick up a phone and give some, advice or signposting or engage with you further. So regardless of whether you're in the East Midlands or not, we're here to support you essentially. Okay, so we're going to dive straight in really. I'm going to talk about the impacts of global trade on sustainability. Well, what I've got here, I'm not one for bullet points in PowerPoint slides. Here I've pulled out two global maps that Boston Consulting Group pulled together, which talks about kind of like the changing nature of trade over the course of a number of years. So you can see kind of like the main what were the main supply routes and how that is kind of changing. If you want to pull down the report yourself, it's a really, really good read actually. It's redrawing the map of global trade. But just to add some further, sorry, I'm just letting somebody in. Just to add a little bit more meat on the bones and kind of give an indication of the scale of what we're talking about here. Trade accounts for some 50% of global GDP. So it has a massive role to play in shaping how resources are consumed and how the planet's impacted. Huge role. It's important in terms of sharing innovation and the tech needed to tackle that climate change and that material circularity. So, trade facilitation breaks down those barriers and enables us to share those ideas. We can't tackle climate change and social inequality on our own as the UK. We need to tap into expertise and knowledge from other markets also. And that's where one of the positives of global trade comes in. If you think about the actual flow of goods, I think Boston Consulting, their estimate here of 18 trillion is actually a little bit conservative. We see more figures quoted of more than 22 trillion worth of goods flow across the world every year. And by 2030, that's going to have increased to 35 trillion. So it's huge. We are a global economy. And certainly the UK, our ability to trade globally is imperative. We have to import our food. We don't generate enough food to feed ourselves. Global trade is increasingly important to the UK. So it's not going to disappear, but the requirements that businesses have to fulfill or be aware of, and the compliance measures that they're going to have to get their heads around are going to change quite substantially. The reason that global trade has such a massive impact on sustainability, if you think about it, global supply chains account for up to 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. So it has a big role to play in terms of the impact on our environment. Of that global trade, sea freight accounts for 80% of volume, but obviously it's not the most damaging mode of transport. Air freight is by far and away the most damaging mode of transport when it comes to carbon emissions. And then you know, trade has a massive impact on nature and biodiversity as well. So that, I feel like I'm kind of focusing on the negatives here, but there are some positives. So, you know, the whole globalization environment that we live in now has opened up numerous opportunities in overseas markets, and it's increased economic prosperity. So we've seen, you know, substantial levels of individuals within emerging markets being brought out of poverty because of global trade. And that whole trade and investment liberalization and global integration incentivizes companies to adopt more stringent environmental measures, because without doing so, their exporters can't reach those valuable markets. So, you know, the EU is by far and away, in my view, the most stringent when it comes to environmental measures. And companies in emerging markets or markets outside of the EU will find it increasingly difficult to trade with the EU, which is a significant trading bloc for them, if they don't meet those stringent requirements. So it kind of, trade liberalization actually raises the level when it comes to sustainability as well. But I think the economic growth resulting from trade expansion obviously has a direct impact on the environment by increasing that pollution and also degrading those natural resources, which are integral to our future. I don't know whether any of you have heard of what we call the pollution haven hypothesis. That says that basically trade liberalization leads to a specialization in pollution intensive activities in some countries if the environmental policy in others isn't quite so stringent. There's a lot that you can read about that, and I suppose it's a hypothesis, but there is some kind of truth to it, really. And obviously, you know, we see that trade impacts the environment, but similarly, the environment impacts trade also. So it flips the other way. So climate change impacts trade. So we're seeing increasingly extreme weather events, rising sea levels, which means that our supply, our transport, our distribution are vulnerable through port closures, through decreased productivity, you know, labour, capital and land and so on. So it's kind of trade impacts the environment and the environment impacts trade. It's that kind of relationship. I think in terms of the current state of globalization and sustainability, though, we've seen with COVID and with Brexit and you know, some of the geopolitical tensions at the moment, we've seen the real fragility of our supply chains. We've seen obviously the pandemic, we've seen protectionism with the Trump administration, we've seen trade and tech wars between the US and China, and we've seen increasing regulatory requirements, export controls, embargoes and sanctions and so on. So our supply chains are really quite fragile, and any work that goes into building more resilience into our supply chain can only be a good thing. And I think that the challenge that has been for countries across the world is that sustainability efforts globally have been quite fragmented. So each country up until more recently has been trying to do their own thing. And this is kind of like a global issue and needs to be addressed on a global scale. So it requires a real systematic approach that almost transcends borders and has a non-discriminatory set of trade policies, if you like. Essentially, our supply chains need to be overhauled. We need almost like a backward flow along the supply chain to stimulate the use of cleaner production processes, reuse of materials, and to bring in more innovative technologies that allow us to tackle the challenges that we face. Moving on, sustainable global trade and its importance. So I'll cover what these particular graphics refer to in just a second. But if we think about the definition of sustainability, so there's lots of definitions out there, but the one that I like the most is the ability to cause little or no damage to the current environment so as to not affect the balance and prospects of future generations. An environment there refers to three aspects, both physical, social, and economic. So building on that, the definition of sustainable trade, you could refer to as the exchange of goods and services that generates social and environmental benefits which go beyond the mere creation of economic value, and that promote the preservation and reuse of environmental resources or reduce poverty and inequality. And when we come onto the slide with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, you'll see exactly that kind of like brings this whole thing to life. There's lots and lots of indices in global trade. You'll have heard of Ease of Doing Business Index via World Bank, the Corruption Perception Index. These graphics on this slide belong to the Hinrick Foundation, and they produce a Sustainable Trade Index, which is what you're looking at here, which measures the capacity of economies to participate in international trade sustainability in a manner that supports the long-term domestic and global goals of economic growth, environmental protection, and better social equity. So this is what these two graphs refer to. And I think what it brings to light is sometimes sustainability, we get caught up in thinking that sustainability is about the environment. It's not, it's about the social impact too. So manufacturers, say a UK manufacturer, has to be environmentally sustainable in its production, socially sustainable in terms of how it interacts with its community, how it looks after its employees, but then it also has to be economically sustainable. So that means trade in a way that guarantees its longevity. So I think so many companies get hung up on, oh, we can't measure this, so therefore we can't meet our, we can't demonstrate what we're doing from an environmental perspective. And they forget completely about how much power they have to create impact on the social side of things. But we know that it's important. We know that society is demanding a more sustainable economy, and that's really setting the direction of travel for future businesses, for politics, for legislation, and it encompasses so much more than just CO2 reduction. So the social aspect of sustainability is really, really important. And I think the challenge over recent decades with trade is there's been a global trade, there's been a growing imbalance in terms of who benefits from trade. So we've seen developed countries benefit far more than developing countries. And that's not fair. There has to be some mutual benefit. So as I said earlier, global trade can be really, really powerful in terms of lifting people out of poverty. The World Trade Bank cites 1.2 billion have been lifted out of poverty due to global trade since 1992. That's pretty impressive, but there's so much more that could be done. And as I say, trade has to be a win-win. It has to be a win-win. We saw the US-China trade friction. Essentially the US felt that China was getting an outsized benefit from trade. So it started to impose tariffs on more than 360 billion of Chinese goods, and China imposed tariffs on US goods, and it all got really, really messy. So that imbalanced trade has a hugely negative geopolitical and economic repercussion. So it's really important that it's a win-win situation. And I think a lot of trade deals that have been struck now are starting to recognize that. But as I said earlier, that whole sustainable trade can help combat the fragility of our supply chain. So those fragilities that were highlighted massively by COVID, by climate change, by the military conflict in Ukraine, and by, here in the UK, by Brexit. We've seen massive supply chain disruption. We've seen pretty ominous food crisis. We've seen inflation. International trade allows cross-border exchanges of ideas and information, and really fosters that innovation that's essential in addressing challenges like climate change. I think one of the things that I've heard more recently in talking to clients when we've had focus groups and so on is it's come up that kind of sustainable trade has to be inclusive. So it must include everyone, regarding of whether they are a developing nation or a developed nation. So if you think about it, developing nations have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. They're disproportionately impacted by climate change and conflict, and they need much more generous assistance from developed countries like ourselves, whether that be individually or whether it be through international institutions, through climate and trade finance or technical assistance, technology transfer, and so on. But we need to be helping them with other forms of capacity building. You've been aware of fair trade for some time now. That's a long-standing policy of reducing poverty and inequality. But there are far more newer initiatives now that are looking at a product's full life cycle and related services. So looking more at zero waste and the circular economy and so on. And I think the challenge is that ideas are plentiful. And we work a lot with clients in Oxfordshire. There's some big brains in Oxfordshire. Very, very clever people with some phenomenal ideas. But I think the political will is still, to a certain extent, lacking to revitalise that kind of multilateral trading system, building on the principles of sustainable development. So that there is being some progress made, and we'll cover that in a future slide, but it's just that little bit too slow, if you like. In terms of sustainability framing the future of global trade, so obviously sustainability concerns and regulation impact all aspects of global trade. If you think about it, you know, from raw materials to intermediate products to the end of life cycle products, as well as business partners and suppliers across the entire value chain. So sustainability can be an enabler, but it can also be a showstopper. What I've got here on this slide is ESG, environmental, social, governance related regulations that are increasing globally. And there's some really important ones there to focus on that will have a direct impact on UK importers and exporters. So, you know, whether it's kind of top of your agenda or filtering towards the top, it can't be ignored. It absolutely can't be ignored. You know, we're seeing changing consumer behavior, changing purchasing strategies. We're seeing more sustainable investing. And we're seeing investors really scrutinize a company's sustainability values and credentials. So it's here to stay, folks. And to me, it kind of feels a little bit like Brexit #2, but just on a huge, much bigger scale. And it sometimes frightens me that particularly our smaller businesses are so not prepared, if that makes sense, because they are going to be the ones that are disproportionately impacted. And I'll cover some of that in a second. But if you think as small businesses, they're often small cogs in very, very large supply chains. So they're going to be forced to meet sustainability requirements as a direct result of them being part of that supply chain, even if it isn't a government initiative to have them do their reporting or whatever. They're potentially going to have to be compliant in order to continue working with larger organizations. And I think, to be honest, even though a lot of the sustainability regulation that's coming in at the minute is just at the corporate level, it'll filter down. That's the direction of travel. And I think, you know, up until recent times, adopting sustainability values, it's been more carrot than stick. You know, it's been kind of like, well, you know, voluntary reporting and voluntary this and so on. This is changing. And trade policy, will be the absolute mechanism used to enforce that change, because they're really powerful tools to not only increase resource efficiency, but scale up investment in clean and resilient infrastructure and accelerate that climate-friendly innovation. So trade policies are massively powerful, and we're going to start to see them really bite. In countries like the UK, we're not the best, but we're not the worst. We've already undertaken several environmental related efforts under the WTO framework. So, you know, we've liberalised tariffs on environmental goods, and we've drafted legislation on fishing at sustainable levels. So we're making some progress. But on a global scale, we're also starting to see inclusion of environmental provisions in bilateral and regional trade agreements, which is fantastic, because that's helping to harmonise regulations between developed and developing countries. So long may that continue. But there's a lot gone on in the last 2 to 3 years, and I think perhaps spurred by COVID, but if you just look at the dates of some of this legislation on this slide here and regulation, there's a lot happened recently, and it's really starting to ramp up. So, you know, the Net Zero Coalition, we saw over 70 countries agree to work on trade policies linked to climate action. We had the United Nations Environment Assembly in Nairobi, where 60 countries agreed to improving transparency and monitoring of trade trends in plastic pollution, and importantly, sourcing alternatives and looking into I can never say that sometimes, sustainable waste management technologies. We've seen the Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, or ACCTS for short, between New Zealand, Costa Rica, Fiji, Iceland, Norway and Switzerland. And that's gone further than any other trade agreement in terms of climate change and trade. I personally am hoping that that becomes a bit of a blueprint for further negotiations on bilateral trade agreements. We've seen Africa's World Circular Economy Forum back end of last year, which is hugely important because Africa is a continent where many supply chains start and end. So, you know, the message getting there and the impetus really starting to build is massively encouraging. We've seen the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now, I've talked for a while, not scare tactics, but I have said before, you know, in kind of strategy meetings that we've had with some of the LEPs and so on about tariffs are something that governments can use to influence the direction of trade. And we have import duties, we have counter-surveilling duties, we have anti-dumping duties. What's to say that we don't end up having a carbon duty? And this EU carbon border adjustment mechanism is a little bit like that carbon duty. So its aim is basically to prevent carbon leakage where production moves abroad or outside of the EU due to a high carbon price at home. And how the EU is going to tackle this is it will see a cost of carbon associated with manufacturing being applied to the imports of iron, steel, I think cement, fertilizers, aluminium and electricity. So that's a big one coming. And you wonder, you know, we haven't deviated too far from the EU at this point. Could this be something that gathers momentum in the EU and the UK starts to think, actually, that's something we'd like to adopt here at home as well? We've also got the EU's Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. So that is basically putting the onus on companies to identify and, where necessary, prevent, end or mitigate adverse impacts on their activities on human rights. So, you know, human rights concerns things like child labour and exploitation of workers, and on the environment. So that could be pollution and biodiversity loss. So it's really putting the onus on businesses to do their due diligence around their activities, their supply chain and so on, to make sure that what they're doing doesn't harm the environment or society. We're also seeing the EU Circular Economy Action Plan, which has a huge draft. If any of you were listening to the textiles webinar that we did 2 weeks ago, you'll have heard me talking about the impact that will have on the textiles industry and also on other kind of like sustainable products, where there's there's going to be policies introduced around that circular economy piece. In terms of bilateral trade examples, the EFTA Indonesia FTA had far-reaching provisions on sustainable palm oil production, which is really good news. And basically, trade liberalisation will be based on kind of verifiable certification. So only sustainable produced palm oil will benefit from trade facilitation. And the agreement goes even further than that and considers the basic rights of workers and the management of forest resources. So that trade agreement could be a real blueprint for future FTAs. It's gone further than others, particularly in that particular commodity. We've seen the EU human rights sanctions, so that allows the EU to target individuals or entities or bodies responsible for, involved in or associated with serious human rights violations and abuses worldwide. We've seen the launch of the EU's extended producer responsibility legislation. We just published a blog on our website, I think earlier on this week, all about that. We're doing a lot of work with clients at the moment about helping them navigate in typical EU fashion. They've introduced the legislation at the Commission level, but then each EU member state is implementing that legislation in a slightly different way. So it's quite complicated for a UK exporter to be able to navigate that and understand what they have to do if they export pan-European, if you like. So we've been doing a lot of work about helping them register with the right bodies in the right countries and understanding whether legislation applies to them based on the volume of packaging that they export and so on. We're also seeing tariff differentiation in product types. So where there isn't full transparency of supply, the government can potentially introduce tariff differentiation. And we're seeing that in Switzerland. We're seeing Switzerland actually split its gold types. So it differentiates between gold that has transparency of supply and gold that doesn't. And obviously gold that has transparency will be subject to more preferential rates of import duty and so on than that gold that doesn't have that transparency. Forced labour, we're seeing the UK introduce a series of measures to help ensure that we as British companies are not complicit in or profiting from human rights violations in Xinjiang province. And then finally, we're seeing still those soft laws or those non-mandatory standards. So some of you might be aware of voluntary sustainable standards, VSSs. And the other one, what was the other one I wanted to mention? The UN's guiding principles on business and human rights. So sustainability labels are increasingly demanded by many consumers. They want to know that the products that they're buying are from brands that align with their values. And actually, interestingly enough, the number of VSSs, get your math around that, have increased from over 50 to 450. That's cited by the Eco Label Index, which is another interesting index to take a look at. So there is a lot happening and it's really ramping up, and I can guarantee you, certainly with the businesses that we talk to, they're not aware of this. They're not aware that sometimes, I don't know what it is. I don't know whether it's kind of, particularly with SMEs, they have so much on their plate. They have so much, they wear so many different hats on so many different days that they don't have the capacity to think about this or to plan for this effectively. And I'm just afraid it's going to jump up and bite them, because all of a sudden they won't be able to trade with a particular country because they're not aware of this regulation and they're not compliant. So it is a bit of a scary one for me. On to the exciting stuff. This is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and there's a huge website dedicated to it. This, for me, is a perfect framework for anyone to get their head around. And what I love about the SME community, they make up the vast majority of global businesses. They can't address all of these. We don't have the capacity to address all of these individually. But if we just chose 2 or 3 to target or focus on, or have our businesses focus on, our collective power to drive impact and change would be massive, absolutely massive. So as I said, these are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. They have 169 targets that are attributed to them. They're developed by the United Nations. And essentially, the UN believes that international trade is the engine for inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction, and a massive important means to achieving these sustainability development goals. And you can see it, you can make the kind of like link yourself to a certain extent. So if we made some simple links, if we were to lower trade barriers, they can contribute to achieving goal one, which is ending poverty. If we're reserving rising food export restrictions, can help achieve goal 2, which is ending hunger. If we lower barriers to trade in pharmaceuticals and other medical products, that can help achieve goal 3, which is health and well-being. And if we build on existing efforts to engage more women in trade, we can help achieve goal 5, which is gender equity. So there's lots of different things that we can do at the business level, but then also at the global trade level to have a massive impact on achieving these 17 goals. Perhaps the body, in terms of global trade, the body that has a hugely important role to play in steering nations towards getting their heads around this and kind of developing their strategies and their trade policies around the SDGs is the WTO, so the World Trade Organization, has a huge role to play. All 164 members of the WTO are also members of the United Nations and have agreed to these SDGs in principle. So traditionally, trade agreements have always aimed to lower trade barriers, but moving forward, they'll have an increasing focus on sustainable development. And with good reason, because trade barriers can have a real pernicious effect on sustainable growth. So if you think about agricultural subsidies of developed countries, which we have here in the UK, they can distort international food trade and deny many developing countries the export opportunities that they so desperately need. But they can also rob us, as developing nations, of vital learning from indigenous populations who have used their traditional sustainable practices and you know, had very sustainable cultures for many, many years. There's a lot that we could be learning from them. But the WTO has, and its whole sustainability mandate, it's brought about several agreements benefiting developing countries of late. So we saw the limited waiver of IP rights on COVID vaccines for developing countries. That was, the WTO was instrumental in getting that done. A delay in tariffs on digital trade. We've seen humanitarian food relief exemption from food export restrictions. We've seen the introduction of new disciplines on fisheries and subsidies to preserve declining fish stocks. So the WTO plays a massive important part. And I think most remarkably, it's got 73 members of its organization that account for 84% of world trade, now actively engaged in structured discussions on trade in environmental goods, on environmental and other subsidies, and on circular trade, including plastics pollution. So WTO is a massive important player in getting adherence to these goals. Now, the importance of stakeholder involvement, I'm just going to rush through this quickly because it's not our area of expertise, and we draw on, we bring in basically our associates to conduct these. But materiality assessments are formal exercises that are aimed at engaging stakeholders to find out how important specific environmental and social and governance issues are to them. So the kind of insights that you can gain from a materiality assessment can then be used to guide your strategy, your communication, and help you tell a more meaningful, sustainable story. Massively, massively powerful. If you're considering conducting an assessment, then there's basically 7 steps that you would follow. So, you know, the first one is to make sure that you're gathering those diverse insights from both inside and outside the organisation. So create a list of those relevant stakeholder groups, then identify the key contacts within each of those groups that can provide a meaningful perspective on your company's sustainability strategy. So, you know, consider internal stakeholders, so executive leadership, directors, regional managers, employees, but then also external contacts. So think about trade associations, key customers, key suppliers, NGOs. Get as many perspectives as you possibly can across the whole value chain. And then you want to reach out to those stakeholders. So once you've zeroed in on who you want to engage, get in touch with them early on, set the stage and let them know what you want from them. So what you want from their participation. And I think keep your communication with them or your pitch them as concise as possible without leaving essential details. So your objective should be to express to that group or to that stakeholder why their unique insights are valuable and how their insights will be used to inform your company's sustainability strategy and business practices. You really want their buy-in early on. And then once you've identified and engaged with those stakeholders, start determining what sustainability indicators you want to measure. So you get the insights you want and the insights that you need. So sustainability indicators are often categorized in 3 different ways. So you have you have economic, which is kind of revenue, profit, company turnover. Then you have social, which can be labor statistics, human rights, consumer issues, community impact, and so on. And then environmental, so that could be water stewardship, carbon emissions, waste management, and so on. It's not just about carbon reporting. Some clients get so hell-bent on carbon reporting when we talk about impact, sustainability impact. And then use the data that you've collected and then any initial insights stakeholders have provided. The CSR Europe is a really good source for the kind of things that you can be measuring as well. They give you different indicators. that could be more relevant to your business. And then you design your materiality survey. So to get the best results, they have to be formal. Focus groups don't work. It has to be a kind of survey with structured questions. So a traditional survey format makes it easy for stakeholders to complete and easy for you to analyze results. So you might have you might ask stakeholders to rate the importance and the impact of each indicator you've identified on like a numerical scale, such as 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, and then that gives you the quantitative data. And obviously you can always leave a free text field to gather that important qualitative data, because that insight can be absolutely massive. And then start collecting those insights, analyze the insights, and then really importantly, deliver on it. So you've got those massively important insights. Use them to help shape your sustainability strategy, and use those results and insights. You know, it's a great PR activity as well, you know, in terms of launching formal sustainability reports or summaries that can be shared really widely across different channels, company website, media releases, and so on, to demonstrate to stakeholders that you're taking sustainability really seriously, and that you have had a real holistic approach to it by making sure that everybody that touches your organization in some way has had some involvement in shaping that strategy. So I think if one of my colleagues is here right now, they'd say, you know, it does take time. Materiality assessment does take time, effort, and resources, but it's an absolutely invaluable tool for gathering insights that can help drive that sustainability strategy and enable that meaningful reporting. And it's really the first step to developing that strategy, and it makes sure that the foundations of that strategy are really sound. Finance and investment. So we have different insights. So our core business is global trade. That's what we love and what we do. But we also, for the last 3 years, have run a program for Oxlab, which has been the Escalate program that focused on helping organizations gain access to finance and become investment ready. So we have a pretty significant pool of investors in the Oxfordshire area and more nationally that we work with, that have helped us with different events and mentoring of clients and so on. And so we have first-hand experience of seeing how their priorities have changed and how they're looking to diversify their portfolios and invest in more sustainable related ventures. I think within the UK and globally, investment, that within that investment community, there's a growing sense of personal responsibility to invest in more socially and environmentally conscious businesses, and that's pushed sustainability to the forefront of many investors' minds. I read some research last year that just under 50% of investors interviewed in a poll stated that they were actively looking to invest in green or sustainable businesses this year. And if you think about it, there's, you know, not only certainly with green innovation and so on, that could be potentially very lucrative long term, as well as having the environmental impact. Investors are always interested in minimizing risks. That's one of their core objectives when they invest is, you know, is this venture low risk? And investing in a company whose sustainability credentials are unknown, that represents a bit of a risk to them. That exposes them to risk and could impact their returns. You know, who's to say that that company doesn't have poor anti-money laundering practices or limited board diversity? So at some point down the line, they could be hit by fines or reputational damage, which would hurt their performance, and the investor would be linked to them in some way. So transparency is everything. A recent Carner Earth study found that 65% of UK retail investors are more likely to invest in funds that provide more carbon footprint information and transparency in their plans. So transparency is really important. Now, just in terms of compliance with current and future regulation, best practice starts at home. So as UK companies, we have to be focusing on greening our supply chains, reducing our carbon costs of business mobility, and embracing new environmental technologies. We have to be focusing on impacting others. So, you know, we have to be producing sustainably, consuming sustainably, and this all gives rise to new business opportunities globally as well. And then importantly, that resilience piece. So sustainable trade strategy will help protect against environmental shocks and resource shortages, of which, you know, we have seen and continue to see of late. There's probably 4 points that I would stress here. So embedding sustainability. So supply chain visibility is key to understanding your impact. So you must be able to trace the source of every product and raw material and confirm that its extraction or manufacturing or transportation or working practices are sustainable. And then you have to establish the standards that deliver against your company's sustainability values and that will satisfy relevant regulations. So you have to ensure that procurement vets suppliers, you have to have systems to monitor and measure environmental impact, and you have to take seriously your treatment of employees and your support for communities. And if you're willing to go that far, then there's lots of support out there. So, you know, you should be looking to take advantage of sustainable incentive schemes. There's export credit support for sustainable and green projects like renewable energy, biodiversity conservation, affordable housing and food security. You've got to build resilience, so prepare for climate change disruption to your supply chain. You know, we're seeing a lot of shifting rain patterns, we're seeing extreme weather events like forest fires, flooding and drought. They can all threaten both availability of products and trading routes. So massively important to focus on that resilience. Keep on top of evolving policy and regulations. So regulations are constantly evolving, and it's an absolute headache for particularly small businesses who don't have the resources to dedicate to this. But they're constantly evolving at both the national and the transnational level. So, you know, we've seen the US-led Kimberley process for diamond certification, the EU conflict minerals regulation, the UK's Modern Slavery Act, the UK's focus on reducing deforestation and supply chains, the EU Sustainable Products Initiative. The list is just endless. But I think much sustainability regulation focuses on the corporate sector, as I've said, but it will trickle down to the SME level, either via supply chain requirements or through legislation extension. So companies must understand their business products and supply chains to understand regulatory impact and compliance requirements. And then start reporting on sustainability. So that whole non-financial disclosure is becoming as important as traditional company reporting in the corporate sector. So investors and rating agencies are now analysing company reports to determine whether the organisation is meeting its sustainability targets and factor these into their overall assessment of corporate performance. And there's lots of different sustainability reporting frameworks. That's the challenge. There's no single global standard, but probably the most prominent guidance you can source from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD. That's part of the G20's Financial Stability Board. So that includes metrics on carbon footprint, renewable energy, management of climate risk, equal pay, diversity, and so on. It's pretty extensive. That's a really, really good source, the TCFD. And then start to incorporate sustainability into existing compliance frameworks. So a lot of the work that we do as Global Trade Department is around compliance, around trade compliance and HMRC compliance and destination market regulatory compliance. Sustainability compliance is going to be probably massive. So obviously, as we know, with international trade, regulatory compliance is a large part of international trade, but that sustainability is going to add another level of complexity. So companies are going to have to increasingly evaluate to which degree they're exposed to legal sustainability risks and how they affect their trading activities. And then beyond mandatory regulations, they're going to have to identify industry-specific standards and consider customized corporate goals. And then they're going to have to define the level of sustainability that they're targeting as a business, and then align this with their existing strategy and framework. Define a kind of fit gap analysis, but on 3 levels. So trade compliance, corporate responsibility, which can be supply chain, and then external communication. And then they're going to have to amend their trade compliance and control frameworks accordingly. So including elements of corporate responsibility, and implementing communication channels. And the EU's business partner due diligence, they really take that process to the next level by scaling that up to cover the supply chain as well. And then refining communication on sustainability and corporate responsibility. So add a new dimension by strategically including trade compliance and its relevant sustainability elements into their reporting. So kind of interlink communication functions with trade compliance functions. So a lot of work to be done, but there is a lot of support out there, not least by ourselves, but other organizations which are more ingrained in sustainability. Perhaps don't have the global trade expertise that we have, but you know, there's lots of support and the two can marry together really, really well. Global trade sustainability assessments, just touching on this briefly, because this is something that we do as part of our work for the East Midlands Growth Hub Cluster, but also for our own private clients. Essentially, you know, we've talked today about how the carrot's starting to give way to the stick and regulations becoming more stringent, and there's going to be associated fines to enforce compliance. So really SMEs should be using this time to get ahead of the game and place sustainability at the forefront of their business agenda. And these global trade sustainability assessments that we conduct kind of start that journey, if you like. So, you know, as part of a sustainability assessment, we'd look at the 4 key areas of environmental impact, social impact, economic impact, and governance. And importantly, the company's stance, strategy, and activity across those areas, both domestically but globally. And we have our own proprietary framework of metrics. So, you know, within the environmental piece, we consider carbon or sustainability reporting, attempts to use renewable energy sources, etc. But with social, we focus on ethical supply, diversity, and much, much more. So we've got our own proprietary framework. Assessments are conducted remotely over Zoom or Microsoft Teams, and the deliverables are a written report with tangible, kind of achievable changes that you can implement to dramatically improve sustainability standing, reduce costs, engage staff, and so on, and really get you on that journey. And what some clients have actually done is to use the assessment to form the basis of subsequent policy. So be that environmental or an ISO 14001 action plan, if that's a standard that, you know, you are looking to hopefully obtain. So that's really it. I'm just gonna, I don't know how many of you today are on from the East Midlands, but this is the programme of support that we have in place for the East Midlands. As you can see, there's a sustainable trade planning piece there, but there are there's more support available even if you're not in the East Midlands, and I've included several different mechanisms to get in touch with us. I'll send these slides out to all of you that have attended today, and you also welcome to access a recording of the session as well. And I'm just going to quickly stop recording because I'm going to stop sharing as well, and then I can take